a small cluster of British territories lying just off the coast of Normandy, France. These peaceful islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, and Sark, had been connected to the English crown since 1066. But on June 30th, 1940, they would become the only part of the British Isles to fall under Nazi occupation during World War II. And it happened so fast, the invasion was essentially over within an hour. No major battle, no heroic last stand, just a swift, almost silent takeover that would last 5 brutal years. This is the story of Britain's quickest defeat, and why it mattered more than anyone realized at the time. To understand what happened to the Channel Islands, we must first go back to May 1940. The German Wehrmacht was unstoppable. Belgium fell, the Netherlands collapsed. Luxembourg was overrun. And then came France, the great military power of Europe, which crumbled in just 6 weeks. The speed was unprecedented. The German blitzkrieg tactics combining air power, tanks, and mechanized infantry overwhelmed everything in their path. By mid-June, German forces were racing toward the English Channel. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in what Churchill called a miracle of deliverance. But they left behind their heavy weapons, tanks, and artillery. Britain now stood alone, virtually disarmed, facing the full might of Nazi Germany. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped, but at tremendous cost. The psychological impact was devastating. France was finished. Britain appeared to be next. On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill addressed Parliament with words that would define Britain's darkest hour. The Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. But even as Churchill rallied the nation with his magnificent oratory, painful decisions had to be made about what could and could not be defended. The Channel Islands were home to approximately 94,000 people in 1940. These were prosperous communities built on fishing, agriculture, and tourism. Jersey and Guernsey were the largest islands, with smaller populations on Alderney and Sark. The islands enjoyed a unique constitutional status as crown dependencies, not quite part of the United Kingdom, but under the protection of the British Crown. They had their own laws, their own governments, and their own way of life. They had known peace for generations. On June 15, 1940, the British War Cabinet met to discuss the unthinkable. With the German army now controlling the entire French coastline, the Channel Islands were impossible to defend. They were only 14 miles from the French coast, but over 100 miles from mainland Britain. Defending them would require troops, ships, and aircraft that simply didn't exist. Churchill struggled with the decision. These were British people, British territory. But military reality was brutal and undeniable. The islands would have to be demilitarized and left to their fate. On June 19th, island governments announced that voluntary evacuation was available for those who wished to leave. But the notice was sudden and chaotic. Parents had just hours to make an impossible choice: stay in their homes with everything they knew, or flee to mainland Britain with only what they could carry. Families were torn apart by these decisions. Children were evacuated separately from parents. Husbands stayed while wives left. The scenes at the harbours were heartbreaking, crying children, desperate farewells, people leaving homes their families had lived in for centuries. In Guernsey, the evacuation began with the school children. On June 20th, parents were told to bring their children to the harbour the very next morning. Many parents couldn't even go with them. teachers were ordered to accompany the children to England. Imagine being a parent, putting your child on a boat, not knowing when or if you would see them again. Approximately 17,000 people evacuated in total, but 42,000 remained behind. Some couldn't bear to leave their homes. Others had elderly relatives who couldn't travel. Many simply didn't believe the Germans would really come. By June 20th, the islands were officially demilitarized. All military personnel withdrew. Defensive positions were abandoned. The islands were declared open towns, meaning they would not be defended. But crucially, the British government decided not to inform the Germans of this decision. Why? Perhaps they hoped the Germans wouldn't bother with such small targets. Perhaps it was simply an oversight in the chaos of those desperate weeks. Either way, this decision would have tragic consequences. The Germans, meanwhile, were making their own reconnaissance flights over the islands. They could see the harbours, the buildings, the infrastructure, but they couldn't tell if the islands were defended or not. From the air, everything looked normal. They had to assume British forces were present. After all, why would Britain simply abandon British territory? The Germans prepared for resistance. On June 28, 1940, the nightmare began. German bombers appeared over Guernsey and Jersey. They targeted what they believed were military convoys in the harbours. In St. Peter Port, Guernsey, a line of lorries stood at the harbour loaded with tomatoes destined for England. The German pilots thought they were military vehicles. They attacked. Bombs rained down on the defenceless harbour. Buildings exploded. People ran screaming through the streets. When the smoke cleared, 33 civilians lay dead in Guernsey. Another 9 died in Jersey. These were innocent people, dock workers, shopkeepers, families killed because the Germans didn't know the islands were undefended. The bombing was a shock to everyone. The islanders realized with horror that help was not coming. No RAF fighters appeared to defend them. No anti-aircraft guns fired back. They were truly alone. The British government finally announced via BBC radio that the islands had been declared open towns, but by then the damage was done. 44 islanders were dead. The survivors waited in terror for what would come next. June 30th, 1940 started as a quiet Sunday morning on Guernsey. People were still recovering from the shock of the bombing 2 days earlier. They didn't know that high above them, a German reconnaissance pilot was about to change everything. Hauptmann Lieber Peteritz flew his Dornier Do-17 over Guernsey and noticed something strange. The airfield appeared completely abandoned. No anti-aircraft fire. No fighters scrambling to intercept him. Nothing. Acting on initiative that would stun his commanders, Lieber Peteritz made a decision that would define the invasion. At approximately 7 p.m. on June 30th, 1940, Hauptmann Lieber Peteritz landed his reconnaissance plane at Guernsey Airport. He taxied to a stop and stepped out onto British soil. No one challenged him. No shots were fired. He walked around the airfield, finding it completely deserted. He even encountered some confused local police officers who told him the island was undefended. Lieber Peteritz couldn't believe his luck. He climbed back into his aircraft and flew back to France to report his astonishing discovery. Within hours, German commanders ordered more aircraft to investigate. At approximately 6:30 p.m., 3 Junkers Ju-52 transport planes appeared over Guernsey. These were the workhorse aircraft of the German military, capable of carrying troops and supplies. They circled the airfield, confirming it was indeed undefended, and landed. The local bailiff, Victor Carey, came to meet them with a white flag. He officially informed the German officers that the island was demilitarized and undefended. The Germans accepted the surrender. Guernsey was now occupied. The actual military occupation of Guernsey took less than 1 hour from the first landing to the German flag flying over island buildings. No fighting, no casualties, no drama, just a swift, bureaucratic, didn't easy takeover. The German soldiers were professional and correct in their behavior, not expecting any resistance. The islanders watched in stunned silence as foreign troops walked through their streets for the first time in living memory. Some people wept, others stood frozen in shock. The unthinkable had happened. On July 1st, 1940, German forces landed on Jersey, the largest of the Channel Islands. Again, the landing was unopposed. German transport planes brought troops directly to Jersey Airport. Within hours, German soldiers were marching through the capital, St. Helier. The pattern was the same, swift, efficient, and bloodless. Alderney, which had been almost completely evacuated, was occupied on July 2nd. Finally, on July 4th, a small German detachment travelled by boat to Sark, the smallest inhabited island. Within 5 days, all the Channel Islands were under Nazi control. Why did Hitler want these tiny islands? They had enormous propaganda value. For the first time, Nazi Germany occupied British territory, actual soil that belonged to the British Crown. German newspapers celebrated the conquest as proof that Britain was finished. The German propaganda machine made much of the fact that the British had abandoned their own people. Hitler also believed the islands could serve as a stepping stone for the planned invasion of Britain itself, Operation Sea Lion. But more immediately, he wanted to turn them into an impregnable fortress. The first weeks of occupation were marked by a strange sense of unreality. The German soldiers were instructed to be on their best behavior. They paid for goods in shops, were polite to islanders, and followed strict orders not to cause trouble. Some Germans even tried to befriend locals. This was part of Hitler's experiment. Could Nazi Germany show the world it could rule conquered territory with a light touch? The answer, as islanders would discover, was no. But in those early weeks, some people dared to hope the occupation might be bearable. The rules came quickly. All islanders had to surrender weapons. A curfew was imposed. Radios were confiscated to prevent people hearing BBC broadcasts. The island's clocks were changed to match German time. Shops could only open at certain hours. Gatherings of more than 5 people were forbidden. Patriotic songs were banned. British flags disappeared. German became the language of administration. The islands were slowly being absorbed into the Third Reich. On October 18, 1940, the German authorities issued Order No. 8. All Jews must register. This was the beginning of the persecution that would eventually lead to deportation and death. Approximately 30 Jews remained on the islands after the evacuation. Some were British citizens, others were refugees who had fled to the islands to escape the Nazis, only to find themselves trapped again. The island governments complied with German orders, compiling lists of Jewish residents and marking their identity cards with red J's. Hitler decided the Channel Islands would become part of his Atlantic Wall, the massive system of coastal defences stretching from Norway to Spain. By 1944, the Channel Islands would become the most heavily fortified place on Earth. Thousands of concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, observation towers and tunnels were constructed. The construction required enormous resources: concrete, steel, weapons, and above all, labour. Where would the Germans get the workers for this massive project? The answer was slave labour. Thousands of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates were shipped to the islands from across Nazi-occupied Europe. Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, French, Spanish Republicans and Jews were forced to work under brutal conditions. They lived in camps surrounded by barbed wire, received minimal food, and were worked to exhaustion. In Alderney alone, 4 labour camps held over 4,000 forced workers. Beatings were common. Summary executions occurred. The death toll was horrific. Estimates range from 641 to over 1,000 deaths just on Alderney. For the islanders themselves, daily life became increasingly difficult. Food was strictly rationed. Before the war, the islands had imported much of their food. Now, cut off from Britain and dependent on sporadic supplies from France, hunger became constant. Rations were reduced again and again. People survived on potatoes, turnips, and whatever they could grow in gardens. Meat became a distant memory. Sugar, tea, and coffee disappeared entirely. By 1944, islanders were slowly starving. Resistance was dangerous, but it happened. Some islanders hid escaped Russian prisoners, risking execution if caught. Others printed underground newspapers to counter German propaganda. The most common form of resistance was painting V for Victory signs on walls and buildings after a 1941 BBC appeal to occupied Europe. The Germans responded harshly, threatening to punish entire neighbourhoods if the culprits weren't found. Some resistors were sent to concentration camps, others were executed. In September 1942, the Germans announced mass deportations. All British-born residents who had moved to the islands after 1919 were to be sent to internment camps in Germany. Approximately 2,200 people were deported, families torn apart. People given hours to pack a single suitcase, then transported by ship and train to camps in Germany. They would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire, suffering from cold, hunger, and disease. Many would not survive. In April 1942, the German authorities in Guernsey received an order from Berlin that would seal the fate of 3 women. Therese Steiner and Augusta Spitz, both Austrian, and Marianne Grunfeld, who was Polish, were the last foreign-born Jews remaining on Guernsey. The island government was ordered to hand them over. The bailiff of Guernsey complied. On April 21, 1942, the 3 women were taken to St. Peter Port Harbour. Some islanders wept as they watched them leave, but no one intervened. The women were transported to France, then to the transit camp at Guernsey, and finally to Auschwitz. Therese Steiner, Auguste Spitz, and Marianne Grunfeld were murdered in Auschwitz. They were gassed upon arrival. Their lives ended in the industrialized horror of the Holocaust. They died because they were Jews. They died because an island government followed orders. They died because ordinary people stood by and watched. Their story is the darkest chapter of the Channel Islands occupation, proof that collaboration with evil, even passive collaboration, has terrible consequences. By late 1944, the situation in the Channel Islands was desperate. D-Day had come and gone. Allied forces had liberated France. But the Channel Islands remained under German control, now completely cut off from supplies. Both occupiers and occupied were starving. Food riots broke out. People were surviving on less than 1,000 calories per day. Children's growth was stunted. The elderly were dying from malnutrition. The German garrison considered surrender, but orders from Berlin forbade it. The islands were to hold out to the last. Finally, in December 1944, after intense negotiations, a Swedish Red Cross ship, the SS Vega, was allowed to bring food parcels to the islands. The arrival of the ship was like a miracle. Starving islanders received their first proper food in months. The parcels contained flour, sugar, chocolate, dried milk, and other precious supplies. The SS Vega would make 5 more trips before the war ended, literally saving thousands of lives. Without these shipments, mass starvation would have occurred. Meanwhile, the massive German fortifications stood ready but useless. Enormous amounts of concrete, steel and slave labour had gone into building defences against an Allied invasion that never came. The Allies had simply bypassed the islands. There was no military value in attacking them. The German garrison of over 20,000 troops sat in their bunkers, cut off and forgotten, slowly starving alongside the people they occupied. The fortress had become a prison for everyone. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but the Channel Islands were still under German control. The garrison commander was waiting for direct orders from the German Naval Command. On the morning of May 9, 1945, HMS Bulldog, a British destroyer, appeared off the coast of Guernsey. The ship carried British officers authorised to accept the German surrender. After nearly 5 years of occupation, liberation had finally arrived. The German garrison commander, Vice Admiral Friedrich Hofmeier, signed the unconditional surrender aboard HMS Bulldog on May 9, 1945. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. The German forces would lay down their arms. Over 20,000 German soldiers would become prisoners of war. The Nazi flags were lowered. The Union Jack was raised. After 1,795 days of occupation, the Channel Islands were British again. When the news spread through St. Peter Port, the reaction was explosive. Thousands of islanders poured into the streets. People who had survived on near starvation rations found the energy to dance, sing and celebrate. British flags that had been hidden for 5 years appeared everywhere. The church bells rang out, no longer forbidden. People wept with joy, embraced strangers and sang "God Save the King" at the top of their lungs. Children who had been born during the occupation saw Union Jacks for the first time. It was pandemonium, glorious, cathartic pandemonium. Winston Churchill, who had made the agonizing decision to demilitarize the islands 5 years earlier, addressed the nation on the day of liberation. He spoke of his joy that the islanders were free at last, that their ordeal was over, that they had endured with courage and dignity. But Churchill also knew the full cost. The islands had suffered tremendously. People had died. Others had been deported, imprisoned, starved. The psychological scars would last generations. The German occupation of the Channel Islands lasted 1,795 days longer than the occupation of any Western European territory. It began with the quickest invasion of World War II, a bloodless takeover that took less than 1 hour on June 30th, 1940. But that 1 hour led to 5 years of suffering. 44 people died in the initial bombing. 3 Jewish women were murdered in Auschwitz. Between 641 and over 1,000 slave labourers died building fortifications. Countless others died from starvation, disease, and the hardships of deportation. Why does this story matter? Because it shows what happens when military calculations override human concerns. The British government made a rational decision the islands couldn't be defended, but the price was paid by ordinary people who found themselves under Nazi rule. It also shows the grey areas of occupation. Most islanders neither collaborated nor resisted. They simply tried to survive. The island governments had to administer daily life under German orders. Where was the line between necessary cooperation and shameful collaboration? There are no easy answers. The fortifications remain today as grim reminders. Tourists visit the massive bunkers, the underground hospitals, the gun emplacements. They walk through museums that tell the story of occupation. Every May 9th, Liberation Day is celebrated throughout the Channel Islands with parades, ceremonies, and remembrance. The elderly survivors grow fewer each year, but the memory endures. The one-hour invasion of the Channel Islands was Britain's quickest defeat of World War II, but the 5-year occupation that followed was a slow-motion tragedy, a test of human endurance, dignity, and moral courage that revealed both the best and worst of human nature under extreme circumstances. The Channel Islands were small, remote, and strategically unimportant, but to the people who lived through those 5 years, they were everything: home, heritage, and a test of survival they would never forget.